I would like to introduce you. It's my great pleasure to have Ray Drainville and Jenny Saul from University of Waterloo. So Ray works on digital media and visual culture. So he writes on iconography on social media, whereas Jenny Saul, we know how many strands of photos we have. So she works in philosophy of language, social and political philosophy, feminist philosophy, philosophy of race. And you co-edited a wonderful handbook on implicit bias and works in deception in relation to political discourse. So today we'll have an instance of a dog whistle and other work that you have on racial fig leaves and a book on lying, misleading, and what he said. So today you'll be talking about dog whistle, and the material is appended to our web page in case you need a paper. So great to have you.
Thanks so much. This paper is something that, is a good thing to come out of the pandemic, I guess. It's what you get if you lock a philosopher of language in the house with a visual studies person. And if this goes on much longer, maybe the cats will start co-authoring with us. I'll share the screen now. Okay, let me get. Okay, so just to say we are living and working in exactly the same place all the time these days. That is actually on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee peoples. We're situated on the Haldeman Tract, which is land that was promised, a broken promise to the Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River in Ontario. We're going to be talking about visual and linguistic dog whistles. I just want to note at the outset that we're going to be discussing some racist and sexist utterances and images, and we will show some of those as well. So dog whistles are, I mean, it's a term that you're probably all familiar with by now. It's a term that's come into political discourse really fairly recently, but gained a lot of popularity. Non-metaphorically, a dog whistle is a whistle that can be heard by its target audience, the dogs, but not by others. Metaphorically, which is the meaning that we're interested in, here's a very broad general definition. It's roughly speaking, it's communicative acts that are effective even though they're fully understood by only a part of their audience and maybe not even by those people. The reason for this paper, aside from the fact that we're locked in the house together for a year and a half, is that there's a growing and quite vibrant literature on dog whistles in philosophy of language. And unsurprisingly, since we're philosophers of language, we focused on linguistic utterances as dog whistles, which is the natural thing to do, and it's quite convenient. But it's meant ignoring something very, very important, which is the linguistic side of dog whistles, or sorry, the visual side of dog whistles. And we've ignored that even when it's actually been a key part of the linguistic dog whistle that's being discussed, even when an image is playing a really important role. And so in my conversations with Ray, he kept urging me to start paying attention to this. And then we decided to do it together because I don't know how to talk about images. I'm just a philosopher of language. So our goal is to start filling in this gap by seeing what we can do about visual dog whistles. And I think it's especially important to fill this gap because images are so important on social media. So if we're talking about discourse on social media and we're not looking at images, we're leaving out something incredibly important. So a little background here. Linguistic dog whistles, when people discuss them, they tend to focus on racist dog whistles in politics for very good reason, because they're very important. These are sneaky ways to appeal to voters' racial resentments. Now, racial resentment is a term from psychology. It's measured through level of agreement with items like this. Irish, Italian, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. And somebody who tends to agree to that counts as high in racial resentment. Now, even though white voters in the US have quite high levels of racial resentment and are pretty happy to agree with that sort of claim, a lot of them, even those people who have high levels of racial resentment, most of them, not all of them, but most of them don't want to think of themselves as racist. And this is why there's the need for sneakiness in appealing to voters' racial resentments. And a dog whistle is one of the techniques that's been developed to do that. So broadly speaking, a dog whistle is an utterance whose full meaning is understood only by, at most, a subset of the audience members. Now, I have trouble giving a broad definition like that because I don't actually think dog whistles are a unitary phenomenon. If you look at the ways that the term is used both in the academic discourse and in the popular discourse, there are at least two very distinct things going on that both get called dog whistles, I think. I'm going to be using the term covert in drawing this distinction, but I do want to note this is a little confusing because all dog whistles are in some sense covert. So I'm going to tell you about the two main kinds of dog whistles that I think there are. I should say the handout that is available to you gives you these definitions in case you want to refer back to them. The terminology is ever so slightly different because I found that people were confused by just having overt dog whistle and covert dog whistle. So I've added in a little bit of clarification to the version that I have on the screen, but not on the handout. So an overt code dog whistle is a dog whistle that works kind of like a code. It's got a secret message that's meant to be fully consciously understood by its intended recipients, and it's meant to completely be missed by the others. And you use a dog whistle like that to communicate with people who would be happy to receive your message loud and clear. The message is overt for its intended audience, so it's an overt code dog whistle. A covert effect dog whistle works, I think, extremely differently. So this is a dog whistle in which the audience is affected without being aware of it. You use this to manipulate those people who'd be uncomfortable with the message that you're sending. So the effect is meant to be covert upon its intended target. So this is, for example, for the people who are high in racial resentment but don't want to think of themselves as racist. And either of these can be intentional or unintentional. Okay, so an overt code linguistic dog whistle, I'll give you a very clear example. This comes from internet conversations amongst white supremacists. So white supremacists have actually developed quite explicit codes to refer to racial groups. So that they won't be blocked as hate speech, they won't be easily recognized as doing what they're doing. So they, established a code where Google refers to a Black person and Skittle refers to a Muslim. And then they share lists of how to use these terms properly. Very clear that this is meant to be a code that's received by its intended users, fully consciously, while other people think they're just talking about candy. Not all overt code dog whistles are nefarious. There's a lovely book that came out a couple of years ago on Polari, which is called Britain's Secret Gay Language, which was at the time when people were persecuted and jailed for being gay. There was a special vocabulary developed of words that gay men in particular could use to communicate with each other without being recognized as doing so by outsiders. So here's a quote. Dudley Cave described Polari words as secret passwords. You could identify with other gay people if you thought they might be. You could drop in a word like camping about. Such code words would be likely to result in a nonplussed reaction if the hearer wasn't gay, so were a reasonably safe way of revealing one's identity without being overly explicit, and could be shrugged off as simple misunderstanding if someone had the wrong quarry. Very, very famous example of a dog whistle that's often treated as a paradigm case actually works quite differently from this. It's the Willie Horton ad. It's a covert effect dog whistle. So this is from an election campaign that I remember all too well in 1988, because I'm extremely old and it was the first time I was going to be able to vote, and we'd had Reagan in office forever, it seemed to me, and Dukakis was ahead and he was going to win, and we weren't going to have a President Bush. We all know how that turned out. The Willie Horton ad played an important role in that. So it just showed Willie Horton's face. It looked like this. He was a violent criminal, murderer, and rapist, and it described violent crimes that he committed while on furlough from prison while Dukakis was governor of his state. That's all the ad did. It didn't mention race at all. It just showed his face. It was actually a very small little local ad buy that was designed to look like it wasn't from the national campaign, but it was actually carefully planned to be shown over and over again on the news as an example of crime in the campaign or negative campaigning. Has it gone too far? And it was successful. It was shown over and over and over again. And it led to an enormous drop in support for Dukakis. Before the ad, Dukakis was ahead by more than 20 points, and it plummeted, that support. It wasn't the only cause of Bush's win, but it seems to have been significant. So the political psychologist Tali Mendelberg studied what went on with this ad during the campaign, because white voters' voting intentions were being tracked throughout the campaign, and so were their racial resentment levels. And she found that as people were exposed to the ad more and more, it didn't increase racial resentment among white voters. But, and this is interesting, exposure to the ad increased the correlation between racial resentment level and plan to vote for Bush. So the more racially resentful people became more into Bush, and the less racially resentful people less so. And then the really interesting thing is that Jesse Jackson started speaking up and saying that the ad was racist. This was not treated with respect. It was universally dismissed by the mainstream media. It was Jesse Jackson playing the race card, totally inappropriate, but it was discussed. And as soon as it was being discussed, the correlation between racial resentment level and intention to vote for Bush began to fall away. Mendelberg thinks if the election had been held just 1 to 2 weeks later, Dukakis probably would have won, which would be a remarkable alternative history that we better not dwell on too much. So her view of the process is that what's going on is unconscious. No new racial attitudes are being.
Just let me. Okay.
Okay, new racial attitudes are not being created. What happens as people are exposed to that ad is it makes their racial attitudes salient. It brings them to bear on the issue that's being considered without the voters' awareness that that's happening. But they don't think it's okay to vote on the basis of racial resentment. And so once they start even asking the question, might there be something racist here? People start monitoring themselves, and the dog whistle doesn't work anymore. So it's essential that it remain outside consciousness. There are terms that have been shown to work in similar ways, at least at the time that they're studied, though there may have been changes since then, like inner city welfare and government spending. And use of these terms brings the racial attitudes to salience, whatever they are, without the audience being aware of that happening. So far, I've talked about intentional dog whistles. We know that the Willie Horton ad was totally intentional because the man who created it, Lee Atwater, on his deathbed said that he'd done all these terrible racist things and talked about it, but usually we don't know that. But we can assume that a lot of these, political dog whistles are intentional. But a crucial thing is that not all the people spreading them are doing it intentionally, and often that's a part of the plan. And so you're going to have people uttering dog whistles over and over again without realizing what they're doing. If the term public spending gets to be a racial dog whistle, which it seems to be, and whenever that term is used, people's racial attitudes are activated, then innocent speakers who don't realize that's going on will be unwittingly introducing racialized connotations when they talk about what to spend the public's money on. If you use the word Google in the wrong place with the wrong audience, you might be transmitting a message about racialized groups that you simply don't intend to transmit. And this fact that dog whistles can be unintentional is very useful for nefarious actors. It helps the message to spread. It was a key part of how the Willie Horton ad spread, was by being repeated by unwitting newscasters over and over again. and it lends deniability. If it could happen unintentionally, then you can always insist that that's what happened in your case. Now, with those distinctions in place, I'm going to hand you over to Ray to talk about images and how some of these can be understood as visual dog whistles. We'll be applying this taxonomy, and hopefully this will yield some illumination.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you. I really appreciate it. I just want to first of all say, I am not a philosopher. I work with one, as you've just seen. But I am someone who does study visual realms. I have a background in art history as well as visual studies, and I do study social media as well. So it's quite a mix. And so I'm very struck by this notion of of dog whistles operating in the visual realm, in part because I don't think dog whistles have been discussed as such by researchers in the history of art or visual studies or whatnot, but they often touch upon things that are sort of adjacent to it. And I think the concept of this of dog whistles seems to illuminate a lot of things on a lot of different levels, on artistic tactics and practices for making imagery, but also the moves made by theoreticians and art and other academics in art history, visual studies, semiotics and whatnot. And I think it's really, really worthwhile to think about it. And I think ultimately the notion of dog whistles seems to have been used for a long time to nudge viewers into thinking about a represented subject in a specific way. So the example I've got here up on the screen is King, probably Ur-Pabelzak from the Royal Standard of Ur. This is around 4,500 years old from what is now Iraq, from Sumer. The term for the king is, and I've got it written down here in cuneiform, so next time you need to write it down, you've got this to look to. Lugal is a king in Sumerian. Now the thing is that that's what it means, king, but it literally means is big man. And what's interesting is a lot of most representations of kings in Sumerian and Akkadian art generally make the king a little bit larger than the other people that are around, sort of making him literally the bigger man, a bigger man than anyone else, which I think is potentially relevant to the subject. Let's talk a little bit about some things about the ways in which people try to actually make imagery in order to actually convey symbolic or convey communications, and maybe in an interesting way. So iconography is a very common way of doing that. You might think of this as antithetical to dog whistles because it's something that artists use and art historians both use. Our artists use it to convey a sort of variety of symbolic types in visual art, such as symbols or attributes or personifications or allegories, blah, 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 so many different types, all of which communicate a message or identify a subject, so we know what's going on. So the example would be the Statue of Liberty here. So what we see is, we have a person wearing a crown. It's called a mural crown because it's not a royal crown; it's a Republican crown, right? So it's something to actually show that it's sort of about popular sovereignty. Holding up a lamp. Or actually a torch, and that's actually it's a symbol of liberty, but it's also a symbol of life, as a matter of fact, in ancient Rome. Carrying a series of tablets were actually about the Declaration of Independence of the United States, right? Often a symbol of immigration has come to be a symbol of New York City, and has also come to become a broader symbol of the United States in general. So oftentimes you'll see this in political cartoons, where what happens to the statue is seen occurring as occurring to the United States in general. So we have here is an illustration of Donald Trump immediately after his election by Leonard Gable for Westdeutscher Rundfunk called "They Let You Do It," obviously referring to his "grab you by the pussy" comment about women. So he's sexually assaulting the Statue of Liberty, sort of suggesting that he's going to assault the United States as well, which prescient in many ways, I think is possible to say. So the thing is, though, you might think this is antithetical to iconography, in part because to make an effective communication, artists have to use commonly understood symbols, right? So you have to know what those symbols are. You have to understand what's going on. Therefore, iconography is not something you can actually really talk about as something related to dog whistles. Maybe not. And that's the thing that's really interesting. So if we actually talk about the way art iconography has been looked at as an art historical method to look at the use of symbolism in visual arts, the case gets a lot more money and a lot more interesting in many ways. So it's mostly associated with the great art historian Erwin Panofsky, although there are many, many other iconographers as well. And one of the early works of some iconographic works that he did was an analysis of this painting by Jan van Eyck at the National Gallery in London, the Arnolfini wedding portrait, so-called. And so he looked at the different details in there, and he noticed that there's a dog in the forefront, which is often a symbol of marital fidelity, especially when it's actually at the foot of a woman. Unworn shoes, which suggests you're actually on hallowed ground. There's a single candle in the candelabra, and it's actually lit during the daytime. That's an indication of a marriage candle, which is something sort of out of fashion nowadays. It still exists a little bit in the Eastern Church, where you actually light a candle during a marriage ceremony. The whole idea is that these are things that sort of concatenated give you the idea that this is actually, even though this looks like a domestic scene, is in fact a symbol of a wedding. Right. And the thing is that's very important for him is that these are all easily overlooked symbols. Right. And so what he thought of this was that this is called disguised symbolism. So what he said that the symbols with the development of sort of naturalism in art, symbols were driven underground. Right. And so for him, naturalistic environments dominate the reception of symbolism. So here's a quote here from that article I mentioned. It is so completely absorbed by reality that reality itself gives rise to a flow of preternatural associations, the direction of which is secretly determined by the vital forces of medieval iconography. So it's either masked or disguised or hidden, driven underground in some fashion. So for him, for Panofsky, iconography functions as an intentional overt code dog whistle. But here's the thing that's really interesting to me. It doesn't violate norms. So it's one of these things where we start talking about the idea about maybe it's worth actually thinking about expanding the notion of what a dog whistle is. You know, Jenny mentioned Polari as a hostile, negative way. I'm thinking non-nefarious way of non-nefarious way of communicating something over someone's heads in many ways. But if anything, this if anything reinforces the norms of the time, right? So it's kind of an interesting example, I think. Now, I want to always point out here that it's unclear whether this is the artist's intent, that these are supposed to be symbols that are just sort of like hidden in plain view. But it is absolutely consistent with Panofsky's interpretation, even though it's not something Panofsky raises as such, right? And it is something that's absolutely had a massive effect in the development of iconography as a method throughout the history of art history since then. So let's talk about more straightforward overt code visual dog whistles. One example would be imagery associated with alchemy in the Middle Ages. And this is an example here from an illuminated manuscript, tilted 90 degrees so you can see it a little bit better. As the wonderful writer Lawrence Principe in his book, he's a chemist and a historian of the science, talks about the history of alchemy. He says the written descriptions often almost seem like the product of a slightly unbalanced writer as it jumps from image to image with giddy abandon, and yet it too can be deciphered practically. And it's much the same thing with the imagery as well. So an example would be this illustration here. This is actually Adam and Eve with the serpent in paradise, right? The idea here is, if you remember your Genesis particularly well, you might not remember that point where Adam gets stabbed in the chest with a lance by the snake. That's because it doesn't happen. It becomes a metaphorical thing, and it's a symbolic thing of the quote unquote torment or the firing and purification of metals. And here, Adam stands as a personification of gold, and Eve stands as a personification of silver. So it's very important. And the thing is that this is actually indecipherable except to initiates, people who actually understand the background of the iconography associated with alchemy, and understand the sort of more esoteric aspects of its writing style. It's sort of like a very, very mysterious writing style. And I would argue that this is an intentional overt code dog whistle. In terms of actually speaking to only specific people out there, right? So let's talk about something a little bit more modern, like the Boogaloo Boys, the Big Igloo and the Big Luau. Now, you might be familiar with the Boogaloo Boys now. Ever since the past several months, this is something that's really exploded with people's general salience of people. But in case you are unfamiliar with it, the Boogaloo Boys are a group of people who are sort of accelerationists, expecting a recurring civil war in the United States, and many of them which actually kind of want that, right? And the term boogaloo comes from internet slang, and it actually refers to a otherwise otherwise forgettable movie from the 1980s. That was a sequel to the original movie Breakin' about breakdancing. It was Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo. The term whatever 2, the sequel is Electric Boogaloo becomes internet slang. So this becomes Civil War 2, Electric Boogaloo, hence Boogaloo Boys, right? So this is a bunch of people who go out and they have automatic weapons. They go to demonstrations and they sort of hope that things sort of take off at that point. But the thing is that that's really important is that the term boogaloo becomes targeted and blocked in social media companies, Twitter and Facebook and other companies. And the thing is that they want to actually circumvent these blocks. Sorry, there's a cat getting in the way of the presentation. I need to get him out of the way. So the thing is here that the groups turn to different terms. Instead of boogaloo, they would turn to big igloo because it sounds approximately similar to boogaloo, or big luau. And the big luau is particularly interesting because that's what actually prompted a lot of them to start wearing Hawaiian shirts with these sort of garish patterns on them, right? And that's the thing that we actually see in this photograph here on the site. And we also see this in this flag here, which is kind of an interesting little mixture. If you're actually familiar with a lot of sort of the contemporary iconography, a lot of right-wing demonstrations in the United States, that black and white version of the American flag usually has a little strip there with a blue line. It's the thin blue line. Therefore, that's usually a thing that supports the police. There's no support of the police here. The field of stars is turned into an igloo, big igloo, right? And that thin blue line is turned into a thin Hawaiian shirt line, right? So they're the ones that actually that are the distinction between anarchy and everything else. They're sort of presenting themselves in a very specific way. So the thing is, their presence at demonstrations is hardly discreet. They're wearing Hawaiian shirts and they're wearing slightly large automatic weapons. But the thing is that the Hawaiian shirts mark them out as fellow believers to one another. And so I think at first, at least, this functioned as an intentional overt dog whistle. It is debatable whether it still does. As Jenny pointed out, with some of the examples like Willie Horton and all that, once this stuff becomes brought to consciousness, people have a tendency to the effectiveness of this sort of communication over your head sort of melts away a bit. But nevertheless, an interesting example. Another example might be one would be the OK symbol. You might be familiar with this as well. Once again, this is something that's been coming into contemporary discourse. And it's a pre-existing hand gesture, of course, where which it just means okay, right? But it's been co-opted by the extreme right, and for a number of years now, the gesture vaguely resembles the letters W and P, as in the phrase white power, which is what we see almost certainly going on in the picture at the top here, the top right here. This is Trump associate Roger Stone, lovely man, and some Proud Boys signaling okay, and they're clearly giving a message there. And the thing is, of course, that they're co-opting something that already existed. People have been using that symbol for a long time. The original gesture allows for widespread use, which therefore goes into plausible deniability. So people always say, "Oh, you're just sort of reading into things. You can make a get out of here." You can make people think all sorts of things, whether or not you're actually supporting white supremacy or not. It leaves everything sort of unsettled, which is something that many of these people really like. And the thing is also, it's really a nice side effect for them, as it allows white supremacists to appear to have greater support than they in fact have. So other people will use the gesture, not realizing necessarily or not remembering that it has this association with white supremacy, right? So it can be either intentional or intentional, and an overt dog whistle. Another example here, which is really interesting, is the example of Brett Kavanaugh during his hearing to become a member of the Supreme Court. One of his ex-clerks, Zena Bash, was behind him, and as she was sitting behind him, she sort of suddenly did that OK symbol with her arm, kept it there for about 10 minutes, and people lost their minds whether or not she actually was trying to give a signal or not, because of course, you don't know. You just don't know. So it can either be received as an intended nefarious signal or not. It can be received as an intended nefarious signal or not. It has an unintentional benefit, where other usages of the gesture become tainted with the association of the far right, and the far right appears to have more supporters than it in fact has, right? Another example might be smug Pepe memes. Now, this is yet another thing that's been sort of co-opted by the far right, sort of fascists and neo-Nazis. Pepe was merely this cartoon character in Matt Fury's cartoon Boys Club. famous for this one example here, where, as he says, where he apparently urinates with his pants all the way down, and so he says, "Feels good, man." The whole notion, this became the catchphrase, "Feels good, man," for the extreme right, and then using this character as an utterly arbitrary rallying figure. It just happened to stick. Who knows why? The interesting thing is that during the 2016 election, there's a variant of this figure where he's in smug Pepe, where sort of looking, smiling, and sort of rubbing his chin there. Extremely racist versions of this exist. What's interesting is that someone created a version where you can't stump the Trump, turning Donald Trump into the smug Pepe, and Trump himself retweeted this. So he clearly is playing along with these true believers. Whether or not he understands any of the background is frankly immaterial for him. He just wants to actually sort of get more supporters, and he certainly doesn't want to contradict them. So the interesting thing here is that it can be both an unintentional and unintentional and overt code dog whistle. So it's intentional because true believers repost the image, and unintentional because other images of the figure become widely tainted with the association of the far right. It was a popular internet cartoon character already, so it could just have these associations, whether or not the poster intends that. And the far right, again, like with the OK gesture, appears to have more supporters than it in fact has. Right. So other example from the history of art would be a covert effect. Now this is a little more difficult. Remember, the covert examples are ones where the audience is affected by it but doesn't realize it. And this is often speculative and difficult to prove, which is why the Willie Horton example is so important. You know, Lee Atwater on his deathbed explained what his intention was, and that was very, very precisely calibrated. We don't usually have that, so we have to sort of speculate it. And an example would be in the history of art is Peter Paul Rubens' arrival of Marie de Medici to France. She's someone who's about to marry the King of France, and she goes to France to meet him, and then take her role as queen of the country. And she is here in this image, part of a series of images in the Palais de Luxembourg in Paris, represented literally above the viewer. There's a literal hierarchical representation based upon the perspective that's being used here by Rubens here. And I would think, and I would argue that viewers surreptitiously take on the notion that this future queen is, as we see here, literally above them, right? And it's, I think, the likely interpretation of this, because Rubens was not only a very, very successful painter of the time and very much a painter of the status quo of the time, he also was a diplomat. He operated as a diplomat across Europe because of his extensive connections with the status quo. So he did a lot of work to maintain the status quo. So I suspect that's probably a sensible interpretation of what's going on with this picture. So this is intentional, but it could be unintentional. You don't know necessarily with a covert effect dog whistle. And I think it's an interesting example, therefore. Other examples could be like, for covert examples, could be surreptitious associations and advertisements. Here's the one for the Panzani from the 1960s. You might be familiar with this because this is an extremely important example for Roland Barthes in his article on the rhetoric of the image. This becomes his classic example of discontinuous signs, right? So we have the shopping bag, we have fresh produce, we have this color scheme, a little bit garishly red, but otherwise a color scheme of red, white, and green, right? So together he argued that this produced a sense of Italianicity and fresh cooking and this slower life that the French would associate with life in Italy, right? So the thing is that what's really interesting is, you know, long before I was an academic, I also spent some time as a graphic designer, and so I'm very familiar with the type of things that we graphic designers would do to try to actually nudge people towards buying stuff. This is very common ploy of graphic designers, where we try to awaken viewers' desires and their needs. It's not subliminal advertising, and they don't have some sort of hidden element within the picture. It's very much right there, plain as day, but you have to be sort of made aware of it. It's just something that sort of washes over you without you really paying much attention to it, because it's ephemeral, right? It's ephemeral imagery like this, like advertisements. They contain elements that are unlikely to be consciously registered by the viewer, because you look at it, You turn the page and you move on from your magazine, or you see it in the metro, and you just glance away very, very quickly. It's just something that is part of the environment, part of the atmosphere, without you really spending much time looking at it. But it sort of reinforces a lot of stuff. So here, obviously, we have red, white, and green. We have the Italian tricolor, for example, very prominently displayed within the image. The colors of the Italian tricolor. To give that association with Italy as well, to really, really nail that association. But the thing is, they slip by, yet they influence viewers' perceptions. So I would argue that this is an intentional covert effect dog whistle, right? So another example would be darkening upon the skin. This is a very famous example from Solomon Messing and his group's work. This is based upon several attack ads, actually during the 2008 campaign, the 2012 campaign, and multiple other campaigns run by Republicans and Democrats. A Clinton campaign actually ran an example like this in 2008, where some imagery of Obama's skin was darkened. Right, and so the idea was where they're trying to actually raise things to salience. They did some testing. Solomon Messing and his group did some testing, interaction of skin coloration, the activation of negative skin stereotypes. They altered images of Obama with lightened and darkened skin. You can see these examples here from light, original, dark complexion. The darker skin and imagery activated more negative stereotypes. The thing is, of course, the participants were unaware that the darkness of the skin was activating those negative stereotypes. But the thing is, though, they demonstrate this functions as what I would say is a likely intentional covert effect dog whistle. Although, of course, it can always be unintentional too. And this is something we need to sort of realize when you actually transcode a bit of I don't know, videotape from one source and then present it to another source. If you're not really, really careful with that work, the colors can go totally wonky. So it's not a slam dunk. It's not a definite that someone's trying to be nefarious there, but it is absolutely, it's a very good possibility that they are too. But it's always important to sort of realize that, you know, we don't absolutely know. That's the problem with covert dog whistles. So final one I'd like to talk to you about today is a hybrid, which I think is interesting here. It's a visual and linguistic together. And this is some, it arises from a couple of things. One is just an experience with the internet, but also with a comment made by a visual studies theorist named W.J.T. Mitchell, who pointed out that visual media as such doesn't really exist. Usually it's a multimodal affair where it's text and picture, voice and video, touch and sight, mixed together. And mixed together, these things sort of concatenate and then provide you some information that otherwise you don't necessarily get from a single thing. Right. So often dog whistles will operate in that space between these multiple modalities, which I think is really an interesting example. Here's an example of a person who just looks like one of a million Instagram influencers, right? Okay, standard design look aesthetic, as the social media theorist Lev Manovich just talked about. You know, got your dusty pinks, simple imagery. Sometimes you'll often see a lot of loopy fonts, things that could be very, very comfortably placed within an IKEA living room interior. That's the type of aesthetic that's often propagated on Instagram. As you can see here with the most common interface that people actually have, which is on their phone, you don't see much of the text. You just see the image that she has of her selfie. So you might like the selfie, you heart it, and that's it. And you don't really think much more of it. You don't see much more of the actual text there. If you click through, if you're actually on a desktop or whatnot, you'd actually see there's actually quite a lot of other interesting stuff going on. She's talking a lot about the abuse of children. And if you actually see down here, we have some things highlighted here of some hashtags, the Great Awakening, pain is coming, and all that. And this sort of obsession with some child abuse and the Great Awakening and pain is coming. These are all sort of tells of someone who's really, really into that conspiracy theory we've heard an awful lot about right now, which is the QAnon conspiracy. And that's what's going on right here, okay? So that text is often unseen. The thing is, though, that gets raised to salience because she's posting that. And just because she's using those hashtags, anybody searching for those hashtags will find her picture. So she's finding a ready-made audience, sort of sub rosa, without us really realizing that, as we're just sort of going through our feed and seeing yet another picture of someone with frosted hair and whatnot, right? So it's really interesting what's going on there and what she's trying to do and how it's sort of being sort of hidden from general view. So she's broadcasting to some people, but it's very, but it's kind of it's done in a combination of image and text, and sort of expanding the exposure of sort of QAnon stuff by doing that. I would argue this is sort of an intentional overt code dog whistle. And that's what I wanted to point out, that hybrid examples sometimes fall between these two posts, and is particularly interesting that way. So I'd like to conclude by sort of saying there's lots of crossover potential between language-based theories of dog whistles and visual imagery. This is something that you don't really see very much in terms, at least, of the more sort of analytic side of philosophy. Visual imagery follows much more of the overt code, covert effect, intentional, unintentional matrix. But it also complicates that. It complicates that dog whistle taxonomy with some new wrinkles. So some suggest that the dog whistles don't need to violate norms. Some seem to occupy multiple spaces. And there are hybrids where the dog whistle straddles what is said and what's depicted, which I think is really interesting. And I hope that's all I have to say to you today. That's all Jenny has to say. I just want to thank you for your time.
Wonderful, super interesting. Thank you so much. So the floor is open for discussion. If you put Q in the chat, Caitlin.
Well, thank you for this. I found this talk really exciting because for a long time I've been disappointed that philosophers haven't been attending to the visual aspects of disinformation. So you see all these analyses of like fake news or misinformation that only talk about almost like propositional or linguistic content. And it seems like visual content is so important in like misleading memes and misleading videos. And so it's just great to see you folks opening this up. I had a question about, so, the way we define dog whistles in like language leaves a lot of language that doesn't involve dog whistles. But when I'm thinking about images shared on the internet, I almost think once you start to say like they are, they have some covert effects on the viewer, and even unintentional covert effects could count, it starts to seem like a huge portion of the images we're talking about might count as dog whistles under that definition. I mean, does that sound right to you folks?
I think it probably depends how much communication is important to that, right? So I mean, is it a dog whistle when someone shares a meme that's like an inside joke? I don't know. I mean, maybe, but certainly, I mean, I think there are some, there's a whole class of imagery that certainly has that type of effect, where there's a substantial political undercurrent to it. I think absolutely is very likely to have some sort of dog whistle effect there as they try to sort of rhetorically persuade.
I would say also that I don't think you need to bring in the visual case to get that worry going. I think there's worries about covert effects of language already, and that's one of the reasons why I keep actually rewriting my definition of covert effect dog whistles over and over again to try to deal with different cases. And it is hard to include all the ones you want to include and not go too far, but it's a very good worry. Thanks.
I didn't necessarily even mean it as a worry, but just like visual images include so much and evoke so much sometimes.
Well, it's something I worry about.
Oh,
but
I do too. Yeah,
I'm glad you don't.
Yeah.
Can I ask, would you count things? So a kind of meme I've been really interested in are ones that include like images that are meant to evoke, like images of a political figure that are meant to evoke like disgust or shame or embarrassment. And it might be included in a meme that's like clearly anti that figure, but it's clear they're picking the picture where the person looks bad. Like I even have one on my desktop that I could, oh wow, it's disabled, but like, Trump with his hair all askew, or like where his fake tan is showing. Like with those things, would you count that as in?
I think to me it would depend a bit on how conscious you're meant to be of what's going on.
Yeah, I think me too. I'd have to see it, because I think part of it is that, it's always, in some sense, obviously it's always there. It's there in front of you, right? It's not hidden. It's not like a subliminal thing where you have to sort of really squint to sort of see the magic figures and like that. But it's usually not sort of knock you over the head obvious, right? So I think that's an important sort of realize. There's got to be a certain point of that sort of just makes it a little bit more hesitant to come across. So examples I've seen for example, that I have seen as a joke, and once you sort of, again, once it's raised to salience, I think it stops working as a dog whistle. But where they have images of Trump where they all they Photoshop his hands and make them really small, right? So once you know that here's a class of images of Trump where everybody's photoshopped his hands really small, it doesn't work anymore. But as you just sort of walk, you go along, you sort of see this image out in the wild, as it were, it's got a very different effect on you, doesn't it, right? And that's the type of thing I think is really interesting. So how is it actually used and all that, and in what kind of context? It gets kind of a lot more confusing that way.
I think also another case that'd be interesting would be the use of images in 2016 intended to make Clinton look old and sick.
Yeah.
And I think some of those were meant to function in a dog whistly kind of way, but I think there also grew up, the Trump supporters, it became an explicit enough thing that we're going to share images where Clinton looks old and sick, that I think it's no longer functioning as a dog whistle. So I think it is easy for things to move from being dog whistles to not dog whistles as they become better known and better understood.
Mm.
And of course, it's also very possible for something to be a dog whistle relative to one subgroup and not relative to another.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Great. So our next question is from Kevin.
Hey, great, thanks. I'll let me just reiterate what Kaylin said. I think this is really great, and I think that sort of expanding beyond the verbal is really, really interesting. Like, Kaylin too, we've both done some work on signaling in animals, and that's a case where there's tons of both visual, but also multimodal communication going on.
Yeah.
And actually, I wanted to kind of bring up a couple of examples, both in the human and animal case, and sort of see what you think about them, to kind of probe whether you think how broad you think dog whistling is, I guess. So it's just sort of some interesting cases. One case that I use a lot when I'm talking about certain types of odd signaling behavior is, and it's connected to the Boogaloo boys that you described, in fact, quite similar, is the case of the Birkin bag. So this is like a super expensive, very rare handbag, but it's not ostentatious. So it's not like somebody could have a Birkin bag and most of us, myself included, wouldn't notice it at all. But if you knew what you were looking for, you would recognize that that's I don't know what it is, several $1 million handbag or something like that. And so that's a kind of like, it's kind of like a dog whistle, right? Yeah. Because it's like, it's showing off your wealth, but it's doing so in a way that only people in the know are going to notice. And I think lots of fashion, especially high expensive fashion, is that form. Like, I don't know enough to tell the difference between an $800 suit and a $10,000 suit, but there are people who do and will notice which one you're wearing, and that sort of thing. And so that was one set of examples. And the other set of examples are from the animal kingdom, where you get lots of cases of like birds will, tune their calls so that other birds can figure out where they are if they're like mate calls, but so that predators can't figure out where they are. So like they choose the range. And similarly, like there are some visual mating cues, which are like the bird can make them very obvious if they're trying to mate, but can also hide them so that they don't stand out in ordinary circumstances. So
wow.
I was sort of curious if you think, are those dog whistles? I don't have I'm not trying to be like challenging. I actually don't have an opinion. I'm just sort of curious to hear what you have to say.
I love those examples.
I love those examples too. Yeah, those are great.
So I guess I kind of want to call them dog whistles. I mean, I think the Birkin bag is really clearly a visual dog whistle.
Yeah, it is. It is 100%.
I think that's absolutely, it's a really great example of a visual dog whistle, which we should stick in the paper. I would want to go back and look at whatever my latest definitions. As I said, I keep rewriting these definitions. I'm worried that the bird example, I might have put in intention in a way, and then people could raise questions about whether the birds have the intention and all that kind of thing, but it sure functions like a dog whistle. And I kind of feel like it should come out as a dog whistle. Those are really cool examples.
Yeah, those are super interesting.
Yeah. I like
Yeah,
that.
I can't add anything more to that. I mean, I think that the idea of intentionality is, well, as you're going to be very well aware, is hard to ascribe to birds, but it seems, I don't know, it kind of thinks like, it kind of sounds like they
looks
intend
like
it. I don't know.
Or they've got a practice of doing a dog whistling thing.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Yeah.
If it weren't a dog whistle, if it weren't intentional, and yet it still had this effect, that is also in itself particularly interesting example.
Yeah, those are great examples. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. So next question from Victoria.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I have a worry about the definition actually. And it's that it completely leaves out the racist or bigoted parts. And I worry about that because it says that it's a message that is meant to only be understood by a new group, right? But this, from what I thought, is that politicians started using dog whistles because it was not a data at the time. It was not politically correct to be overly racist. So that's kind of like, to me, the missing part is that it's not just that it's an inside joke, it's that there is a very specific reason why it is. And also I think that the word is already in use widely by people outside of philosophy. So, and it has this racist connotation, and it has a very negative connotation that, for example, a Birkin bag just doesn't have. So I worry that it's kind of too wide a definition because it's already a word that is being used in a certain way, and that certain way seems to me that is about bigoted language. And
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so
thank you.
You're absolutely right. This is not a definition of racist dog whistle. This is a definition of dog whistle. And part of the reason for that is that there are also sexist dog whistles. And there are, dog whistles against disabled people. And, there are dog whistles of other kinds. Now, all of those are negative. They're violating norms. It's a choice I've made to look at how this kind of mechanism functions and to define dog whistle in terms of that functioning, and then to look at specific kinds of dog whistles and say, look, here are these various bad things you can do with dog whistles. And here is a dog whistle that does something good in the case of Polari, for example. I understand the desire to limit dog whistles just to the negative, but because I'm interested in this functioning, I would rather have a general definition of dog whistle and then distinguish and discuss these various negative things that can be done. And I do that in other papers. But you're absolutely right that it's not built into the definition of dog whistle as I'm using it.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate that, I mean, for me, I find it useful to think of it as in terms of its function, as opposed to just thinking it more narrowly in terms of its nefarious use in those circumstances. In part because otherwise you then have to define something that's very functionally similar in other circumstances, but just isn't racist, right? And then suddenly you get into this, you're basically copying and pasting the same definition, except not racist in this instance, and not X and not Y in another instance. And I just think it's useful in sort of seeing that. I do, although I do realize, and you're absolutely right, by defining it as such, it's sort of pushing against the standard understanding of it.
I see. I don't think it's pushing against the standard understanding in that there is a lot of discussion of things like sexist dog whistles as well. So I think, but I understand. I take your point. We could have done a definite defining dog whistle more narrowly, but thanks.
Great. So I'm not sure if Patrick is still with us. If not, we move on to Michael.
We can't hear you.
Can't hear.
I was just saying I'm back. I'm glad I was able to catch the bulk of the talk. I missed the beginning, but that's not going to prevent me from asking a question.
You've heard that bit before,
you guys could just say, "Oh, we covered that earlier." Obviously, you missed it, you doofus. So one of the things, this is sort of picking up on Kaylin's point and other points too, is well, just to give sort of background, I too am become fascinated with these sorts of questions, not with the visual dog whistles, which is a new concept for me in a way, not dog whistles or visual stuff, but putting those together. But I've been working with art historians and with the American Museum of Natural History on a project about visual representations of science over the last 150 years and how those have been used for political ends. So you can see a lot of overlap. So y'all, we should talk.
Absolutely.
Because that's really interesting to work with a museum that has that many sort of examples to work with. And filled with all sorts of racism and sexism and all sorts of things. But one of the things that's sort of coming clear to me is in talking to art historians, and I think you guys must know this already, I mean, people who work on this stuff, you know, of course, they're like, well, like everything that is involved with art and visual culture is covert and or it involves covert messages. You know, it's like that's just like soaked into the fabric of the medium. And to the point, like, so this book, I've been recommending this book to people. Visual.
I know the book. I've got it.
Yeah. That's Alexis is is the person I'm working with, and you know, she begins with this great example of parenting books for, you know, magazines that people read when they're getting ready or thinking about or, you know, fantasizing about having children. And all the imagery in there is soaked with all these sort of covert gender-based images. And I guess the point I'm getting at is a similar one that was raised before, which is how do we actually disentangle the covert from the overt? I know this was part of what you guys were talking about when I came in, but I just, so in other words, I almost like you guys are clearly on things. Obviously, I'm very excited about it. It's just that I, in my own thinking, have been having a hard time figuring out, and it makes me worry that somehow maybe that's not even the right distinction, the covert and the overt. That somehow we just, you know, we're still taking stuff from language and trying to pull it over to a medium that in some ways is more dominant right now than, or as dominant as language. So anyway, not really an articulate question because I'm too enthusiastic to frame a coherent thought, but take it away.
So in the case of language, one thing it's helpful to think about is how you would go about finding out that there's an overt dog whistle or a covert dog whistle. And I would think with an overt one, like it's super helpful if somebody can show you a list and say, okay, this is the words we're going to use, or a member of that community can say, here's how we use that word, right? And with the case, but with the covert ones, that's not what you need. What you need is a psychologist to study what the effect is on people when they are doing. So, you know, I think in the case of the images, there's similar things, right? Like the Boogaloo Boys can tell you what the Hawaiian shirts mean. And then, you know, you've got an overt dog whistle. The covert one, you probably have to get a psychologist to study it. I don't know if you have further thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said in the talk, I mean, I think part of the problems with the covert ones, and it's always the case, is that, you know, prove it. Go ahead and prove it. You know, good luck with that. You know, so and that's the issue, right?
I see.
It's super difficult to prove.
So we have one that's proven, the darkening of Obama's skin.
Yeah,
I think that's a great case where
it is a good case.
It shows how it functions. Yes, it shows how it functions, but we don't necessarily know whether it was intended as
that's
such,
true.
Right? And that's the thing that's interesting. I think, and that's the thing I find super interesting with that is what's going on with intentionality with that type of thing, because you know, this is when you're talking about politicized messaging, and you know, this is ultimately this is what we're all talking about. A lot of these things, a lot of these examples, they're all politicized in many ways. You're getting to this point where there's a lot of information that you might want to have sub-rows, and you might have an intent to actually do that, but we can't necessarily prove it, right? So the great thing about the Lee Atwater example is that we knew.
Yeah, right, of course. Yeah, right. I mean, I think if I just follow up real quickly, just I agree with you. There's the question of intent in both visual examples and linguistic examples, and then there's this question of function, even if whether you're talking about in the sense that I talked about earlier, or in some other sense, and those are separate, and you have to use different methods to get at them. I mean, in many ways, though, it seems to me that a lot of the political weight is often actually carried by the function bit, not the intention bit. The intention bit matters if we're trying to we're trying to blame somebody or convince them convince folks, let's say the law, to put a stop to something, or Facebook,
Yep.
right? That's where intention matters. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to understand the political fabric of the situation, I think it's really the functioning that it matters. And I think in that way, you know, even if you can't do the psychology, even if, and I would say, Jenny, that for a lot of art, you have to think about art historians, because they need to also think, they're the people that can give you the context in which this thing was developed. But you know, even if that's tough and it's difficult to nail down, especially from a legal standpoint, you know, for a legal standard of proof, you can still get a lot of traction just by trying to make it clear to people how these things are functioning in the way that you guys are doing.
Yeah.
So good work. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I think we have Stefan. I'm sorry that I always I'm confused with the two systems.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Very interesting talk. I was fascinated by that, and I was wondering, maybe you could comment on the relationship between what you're looking at and some, to my mind, closely related literature on the use of humor and pseudo satire by the extreme right, which kind of seems to feed into that, and is, I mean, Trump himself was a master at this. You know, every time he got caught out when he said something, he'd say, "Oh, I was just kidding. You know, the joke is on you. You were too stupid to recognize I was joking." And that seems to permeate a lot of hard right and fascist websites where Holocaust denial is sort of, you know, given the sheen of irony and, you know, satire. We're not really denying it, but ha ha, you know, that type of thing. And so I wonder if you care to comment on that.
Yeah, so that's something that I'm very interested in, and am writing about at the moment. The use of humor as what I call a fig leaf to cover for what's being said and to indicate that it's not serious. And you're absolutely right to point out that the visual stuff lends that, feeds into that.
Definitely.
And both of these are mechanisms that lend deniability. I mean, I think there's so many mechanisms in use, because what we've got is norm violating behavior. And then you want to make, there's some people are going to be just fine with violating the norms, and there's some people who are never going to accept it at all. But there's a group who might put up with it and might not. Mm-hmm. And you want to get enough deniability that they'll put up with what you're doing. Yeah. And I agree. I think images are an important part of that.
I 100% agree. I mean, this is one of the things that's really interesting. There's been a lot of discussion about this in some of the visual studies aspect in terms of looking at memes, for example. And you know, there's nothing inclusive, because you can't be anything inclusive about it, because that's what you do. But it's an interesting subject nevertheless. And I think, it's absolutely an incredibly important component of it. And I would say that there's that aspect of sort of edginess that a lot of people want to work with the imagery, and it allows them to sort of, you know, they often work in a context of making images and whatnot on the internet where edginess is super valued, and so you're just pushing the edginess a little bit farther until something that's actually socially unacceptable, right? And then it's just a joke, right? So it's definitely part of that whole procedure where you're part of that in group that actually acts in that specific way, but maybe you're also pushing it forward as well.
Precisely, and I mean, to me, that's a very problematic state of affairs, because it's extremely difficult to meet without looking like some old bloke who doesn't have a sense of humor.
Exactly.
And that's exactly the point, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you sidestep that whole thing, and how, like, do you have any thoughts on how to meet that head on?
No. Sorry, we don't have a good answer to that.
Well, neither do I.
I wish
neither does anyone I talk to, and it becomes a serious issue when you're talking about platform regulation, for example.
Absolutely.
And legislation. You know, I mean, The Onion would be outlawed by some criterion that involve, you know, that isn't cognizant of the difference between satire and other forms of expression. But of course, the moment you allow that, you weaponize, you know.
That's a great point about The Onion. Yeah.
to the fascists.
Yeah, it's really true. And I think that's an exploited space. That's actively exploited, and quite knowingly so. I mean, some of the examples will be crude because of, well, for a number of reasons, right? Just the content itself will be crude, the execution will be crude and whatnot, but depending upon what the subject is. But it's mostly, it's just, they understand, they have a fairly sophisticated understanding of just what they're getting away with and exactly how they can get away with it. And I think that's an extremely interesting space. I mean, as someone who often has to deal with a lot of imagery that's kind of vile. One of the things when I'm talking to my students, I mean, because sometimes the students will present stuff and they're kind of trying to see how much they can push the envelope. And, I usually refer to myself as Professor Shitpost at these points. And the thing is that I'll call them out on it, and it usually stops then. But of course, I might look like the old fogey, but I'm at least raising aware that I'm aware of what's going on. And I know the background to it, and that is sufficient usually to sort of temper it down a bit.
But it helps that you're an authority figure who's grading them.
Yeah, it does. It does help.
Yeah,
it does. So that's the thing. We have to grade 4chan. That's the answer.
Yes, that's our solution. Problem solved.
Indeed, yeah. It's surprising that in a way that's what we found in our corpus on Telegram. You have this kind of exploitation of code words and kind of deployment of irony and humor as a way of kind of testing who is in and who comes out. Precisely, if you're not kind of vibing, you're like.
And actually, that's a really good point as well. That another thing that all of this feeds into is the crucial in-group, out-group dynamics that
100%.
feed fascism, right? And having the people who recognize what you're saying, the people who don't, and the people who get too upset about it. It's really helpful.
Yeah, I'm impressed. Wonderful. So I see. Is there when you okay? Sorry. Oh my
Great.
God.
People are starting to grade 4chan.
Yeah. Okay. So, are there any more questions? We technically have a bit more time for the general discussion. If there are any other kind of burning questions for previous speakers or free, I see a question from Cynthia. Please.
Hi. I wanted to make an observation about the humor thing where, so Jenny, you said that it can be used as a fig leaf, right? So you can, say, oh, well, I was just joking, and you can kind of get out from under an accusation of cruelty or whatever you're being accused of. But I just wanted to point out that, so I know there's other kind of fig leaves besides saying I was just joking. Obviously, there are other cases, but I just wanted to point out that I think that this I was just joking thing also happens a lot in interpersonal gaslighting when someone
Yes.
The same thing where you're denying, so the person knows for sure that you said it sincerely, right? And that you weren't joking at all. And when you say something like, well, you called me a jerk, and they say, what? I was only joking. So I just want to sort of point out that there's some similarity there between that kind of fig leaf and then gaslighting.
Yeah, and this is a nice fit with the earlier talk. I think sadly we don't have the speaker here, but about gaslighting, and it fits into that, and it helps to feed that sense that I don't know what's going on in the political realm anymore, and I don't know how to deal with this.
That's true. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. These fit together very nicely. Yeah, and it's not just the humor, but also the dog whistles. It's like, I am seeing that. I know it's not just an okay sign that you're doing. I know what that means. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's just an okay sign. You did that when you were a kid. What's wrong with you? Yeah, absolutely.
So any other questions or questions for previous speakers or I don't know, solutions?
Well, one thing I'd like to do is to just commend you on this incredible series of talks and workshops. You've done just such an incredible job bringing together huge range of
Yeah.
fantastic talks.
Great
So
stuff.
a round of
Great stuff,
applause to you.
absolutely.
It's all
Really
to
fantastic.
you for so many wonderful talks and perspectives and different tools, which I
This is
totally enjoy.
then one of the high points of the pandemic. I know that sounds like faint praise.
Yeah. Created new, like we adapt our environment and create new.
Spoken like Pepe the Frog, right?
Yeah.
I gotta go, guys. Thanks. It was great.
Thank you everyone for making time to be with us. And
Thanks so much for organizing all this.
Yes, thank you so much.
But
Thank you everyone
Bye-bye.
for wonderful discussions.